Alright, welcome back guys. This is episode 4 and building an ASP.NET Web API. Today we're going to get hooked up with the database so that we can actually pull data from the database instead of just hard coding it into our controller. So let's begin. First we need to go into our app settings and we want to add our connection strings in here. So the connection string is going to be the information that the program needs to connect to the database. Now I currently do have a brand new Songs API database. This is in MySQL running locally on my machine. So let's go ahead and add the connection strings. Inside of our app settings.development.json, we're going to add a new section here called connection strings. And then we'll add a new connection. We'll just call this one default connection. You can call it whatever you like. And this is going to be a string. Let's give it the server. It's going to be localhost. And this is how you can add different app settings for test and production where you have different connection strings for your different databases. The database is going to be called Songs API. The port is going to be 3306, which is just the default port for MySQL. The user is going to be my username, and the password is going to be password, which is what I have set up on my local instance. Next, let's just jump over to our startup file. Inside of our startup file, we're injecting in the configuration here, and this is pulling from the active configuration, which in this case is going to be our app settings.development because we're running this locally. Now inside of our configure services, we need to get our connection string. There's a couple ways to do this. The first way, we'll just say var connection string. So we're going to get a connection string from our app settings. So we'll just say configuration dot get section, and we're going to get the connection strings section, and from there we're going to get our default connection. Now let's test this out real quick. Let's just say console.writeLine connection string. Now let's jump over to our terminal. Let's just say .NET run. And once this starts up, you'll see the connection string get printed out. So right here, the first line, server equals localhost, database songs API, this guy, that's exactly what we wanted. The other way you can do this is a little bit of a shorthand. We could say connection string equals configuration dot get connection string. So this is looking for a section called connection string, and you're going to get the default connection. So these two lines do the exact same thing. It's just your preference which one you want to use. So I'm going to use this one. We can restart this and see that it is working the same. And there it is. There's our connection string. Now we're going to come back to this later. First we need to set up our database context. So let's create a new folder in our project called database. Again, this can be called whatever you want. And we'll set up a new file called songs API context. Whoops, I need to rename this .cs. Again, these can be called whatever you want, just whatever's makes sense to you. Let's put this in the namespace of songs API.database, and let's create a new class. Now this class needs to extend the database context. So let's import this here using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core, and we're going to extend DB context. Now Entity Framework is the ORM or Object Relational Mapper that .NET uses. This allows us to write object-oriented code that will interface with our database and makes things really clean and easy to read. So this context is going to give our program the information it needs to understand what our database includes, like what tables there are and how to map them to our models. So first, let's create a constructor. So a constructor is just a function with the same name as the class itself. And this is going to take in a DB context options. and the type that we're going to pass to it is going to be the name of this class. And we're going to pass that to the base. Now what base does is it says to use the constructor for the parent class, the DB context, and pass in these options. So we're giving it the options, telling it we're going to use this particular context. Next, all we need to do is tell the context what tables we have. The only table we have is the songs table, which uses the song model. So we're going to say public DB set, give it a database set. What model we're going to use is going to be the song model, which we need to import. And we're going to give it a name that we can use later to be friendly to us. So we'll just call it songs. Now, just like on the attributes on the song model, we're just going to say get set. Alright, so now our database context is set up. Next, we need to wire up MySQL with the app itself. So we need to add a package that allows our program and entity framework to interface with MySQL. Microsoft does not have one out of the box, but there is a third-party one that I recommend from the Pomelo Foundation. So let's go into our console, and we just need to add this package. So we'll say .NET add package, and I will put a link to the GitHub in the description of this video. Go ahead and hit enter. Alright, now we have the package added to our project, and we can check that by going to our CS proj file here. And you'll see we have a package reference to the Pomelo Entity Framework core.mysql and the version 2.2. So now that that is loaded up, let's go back to our startup and wire up the MySQL connection. We need a couple things in here. We need to say using Microsoft.Entity Framework core. And we also need to say we're going to use the Pomelo Entity Framework core MySQL infrastructure. And once we have these two in here, we have our connection string ready. We're going to say services.addDBContext. We're going to give it the songs API context, which we need to add to our using up here. And we're going to get a set of options that we're going to pass to this arrow function. Now inside this function, we just need to tell it to use MySQL. That comes from the Pomelo third-party app, and pass in the connection string. That's all we have to do to get connected to our database. And the rest of this is going to get really easy. And this is something that you'll set up probably once in your app and then use it from there on, and it makes things a lot easier going forward. Let's go into our songs controller. And instead of returning just this hard-coded song, let's return something from the database. However, before we can do that, there is one more thing that I forgot we need to do, and that is setting up our database. Now you can see that we have nothing in here, and we need to build a migration. There's two ways to do this in .NET Core. There's the database first approach, where you build your database and have .NET Core build your models for you, and I'll do a separate video on that later. Then there's the code first version, which is what we're going to do today, which is where we wrote our models and we're going to let .NET Core build our migrations for us. So let's go into our console, and we're just going to say .NET EF for Entity Framework, migrations, add, and let's give it a name. Initial migration is fine. That's going to run, and when it completes, it's going to create a migration based on the state of our models currently. So if we go into our code and we look at our new migrations file here, we have initial migration.cs, which this is just telling us we're going to create the songs database. We have an ID column, that's our identity column. We have our title, our artist, and our created at, with the different types that we had set up in our model. Next, we just need to say .NET EF, Entity Framework again, database update. Now since we have our connection string and everything set up in our startup file, this is going to go ahead and run the script. And if we open up SQLer and refresh, we now have our songs table with our 4 columns, and we also have a migration history table. Now we're ready to actually pull information from the database. First, let me create a couple songs real quick. Now that we've got a couple songs in here, let's wire this up in our controller so we can send this back over to our API. First, let's grab the database context. So we're going to say songsapi.database, and let's create a private field inside of our class here. It's going to be songs API context. And we usually use underscores with private fields, as we're going to, especially when we're going to override it with something in the constructor. So we're going to create our constructor. Again, constructor is just named the same as the class. And we're going to expect a songs API context to be injected into this function. So once the database context is injected, it's going to be assigned to our local private variable, and then we can use it throughout our controller. The way that injection works in ASP.NET is inside of our startup, you can register the services that are going to be injected. So in this case, we added the database context of songs API context, and it is now able to be injected into our controller. So back in our controller, let's go down to our get method here. Let's get rid of all of this, and we'll say var songs equals dbcontext.songs, and that songs comes from our database context where we wired up this DB set. And we want to get everything, and we need it to be some kind of enumeration. So we can just say to array, or we can say to list. It doesn't really matter. And then we'll just return the songs. Now let's open up Postman and make sure this is working. While that's starting up, let's go ahead and go .NET watch run, get the app started. Let's go to our songs API that we created last time, get all songs, and hit send. This may take a second while the app is starting up. And there we go. So we're getting our 2 different songs here. I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of small. These match the same songs that we had in the database, Bohemian Rhapsody and The Way You Make Me Feel. Now let's modify the get ID function here. Instead of just returning the ID is whatever we're passing in, let's actually grab a specific song from the database. So we're going to again go to the database context, grab the songs, and we're going to find the ID. Now what find does is it looks at the identity column on the table and looks for the ID where it matches. Another way you could do it would be database context, songs, and then you could say where, and then do an arrow function where you'd say song.id equals ID, and then get the first. That's an alternate way of doing it, but this is much simpler, just doing a find. So we have our song, let's just return it. We need to change the action result to, instead of returning a string, we're now going to pass back a song. Let's go to Postman and do a check. So let's just do songs/1. We get Bohemian Rhapsody. If I change this to 2, we get the Michael Jackson song. If we go back to just getting all songs, we will see them all right here. So that is it for this episode. If you liked it, make sure you hit that thumbs up. It helps me a ton. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to help you out.